It's The World This Week, 7 days, 4 Paris-based correspondents, 1 hour. The World This Week in partnership with The Daily Beast. Christopher Dickey, foreign editor of said news publication, is with us. How are you?
I'm good. Always glad to be here.
Glad to have you. Glad as well to welcome, well, our Chief International Affairs Editor, Robert Parsons. How are you?
Hi, good.
Claire Byrne, staff journalist for the French news agency AFP. Nice to see you.
You too.
And Franco-Syrian photojournalist Amar Abed Rabo, who's, I guess you could say, the visitor in town, since you're spending your time a bit.
I roam, yes.
He's more of a nomad than a sedentary one. The World This Week on Facebook and Twitter, the hashtag World This Week. The death toll has been mounting all day, forcing us to scrap the script. A gunman planting a bomb outside a mosque in the North Sinai town of El Arish, close to the border with Gaza, then mowing down worshippers as they tried to escape the rest of North Sinai, where insurgents pledged allegiance to ISIS back in 2013. The government, well, it's responded with airstrikes and promises of vengeance.
I reiterate my condolences to the families of the victims and my wishes for the recovery of the wounded. Once again, I tell all Egyptians that this situation, that what happened, will increase our determination to face terrorism with all our strength.
Christopher Dickey, it's not the first time we've seen attacks in Sinai, attacks mostly against the military, against police. There are attacks in other parts of Egypt against Christian churches, but attacking a mosque.
Well, the reports are that it's a Sufi mosque, and the Sufis are particularly hated by the Takfiri elements, the ultra-fundamentalist Sunni elements that support a group like the so-called Islamic State or even Al-Qaeda. So I think that it's not that surprising that they would attack a Sufi mosque. Also, it's been reported, I think AFP reported, that it was also a mosque that was frequented by conscripts from the Egyptian military, and that would also make it a target. The death toll is obviously horrific. The political toll for al-Sisi has to be enormous too. He came into office, he took power in 2013, partly with the support of an army that was frustrated and felt that the elected president, Morsi, who was being thrown out, hadn't done enough to calm the Sinai, to bring peace in the Sinai. Well, the Sinai is not only as violent as it was then, it's a hell of a lot more violent than it was. And none of al-Sisi's strategies seem to have worked. He used to blame everything on Hamas, which is, of course, just across the line in Gaza. But his government has been instrumental in sort of reining in Hamas and brokering a peace agreement between Hamas and the Fatah. And that didn't seem to work either. So I think it really is politically disastrous for Sisi.
Now, there's been no claim of responsibility, so we don't yet know for sure. And there are several radical groups in North Sinai. What do you, though? What do you say when you look at the fact that there were some 40 gunmen who plant a bomb? Who
it's a you know, what they call a complex attack, right? It's a combination of bombs, possibly at least one suicide bomb, and then opening gunfire. It's a classic kind of model for these kinds of guerrilla operations. The question you have is, if it's supposedly tightly under control and there have been massive repression in the Sinai and actually in a lot of Egypt, then how do you get 40 gunmen together to besiege a mosque?
Yeah.
What kind of control is that?
No, absolutely. You know, we've heard reports since it happened as well of Sisi saying he's given the order for his bombers to attack targets in the mountains surrounding the place where it happened. If they knew what these targets were in the past, today, why didn't they know in the past? Why didn't they attack them in the past? It's just a gesture. You know, it's nothing more than that. He's promised a brutal strategy from now on. if it hasn't been brutal up until now, I don't know how he's going to describe it, frankly. The policies he's adopted so far have quite clearly failed. And part of the problem, I mean, there are military difficulties. It's a very big area. The terrain is tough. It's sparsely populated. It's relatively easy to stage attacks in that sort of environment. But he has failed to engage, essentially, as far as I can see, with the local population, essentially a Bedouin Arab population, not like the population in the main cities of Egypt and Cairo and elsewhere, who have systematically been excluded from the politics of Egypt. They have no place. And no attempt, it seems, has been made over the years of the military crackdown to engage them at all.
So we talked about Sufis being the target, perhaps. We talk about soldiers, perhaps, or military
conscripts, yeah.
Conscripts going to this. But of course, there's also, we've heard analysts tell us that it could be because this complex alliance of tribes there, and some of them have turned against the jihadists.
Yeah, I mean, this goes back to the problem I was just trying to identify now. There's been no effort on the part of the government to engage with the local population. And it is quite possible that some tribes are pro-government, some are opposed to each other for reasons that have absolutely nothing to do with the government. But until the state starts to engage with the local population and address its issues, among which are destitution, then these sort of problems are going to continue and continue, however hard the government tries using military tactics to crush it.
Amr Abdelrahman?
The real problem, I guess, is that the military options, I mean, the old security option has a limit. And the other problem is we don't at all talk about let's say, the social response or even the cultural response to Daesh. So you have a government that is fighting Daesh, but on the other hand, the same government is arresting homosexuals. 2 weeks ago, there was a woman journalist on TV who talked about the joy of being a single mom. She was arrested and jailed. I mean, the Daesh values, let's say, are protected or used by the Egyptian government as by other governments in the area.
So what's this all about then?
I mean, you can't fight something and on the other hand use the same words or the same rhetoric or the same policy or the same ideas. So at one day we have to see who is next to us when we say we're fighting terrorism. Who are the people? What are their values? What they aim for? We don't have this.
The counter-narrative, as they say.
The counter-narrative, yeah. And we've seen it in other places. The toll, again, as we speak, it's above 200, but it could rise still further. Is it just this is going to be the new normal? Because we had the attack in Mogadishu where more than 300 were killed back in October.
That's right, and also in Nigeria, and we see frequent attacks on by Boko Haram, but on places of worship as well. So,
if you want to make a mark, it's got to be a high death toll.
High death toll, and Friday prayers in a mosque is going to deliver that. I thought it was interesting that just yesterday, Egypt's Interior Minister briefed Parliament on the counter-terrorism battle and said that Sinai was perfectly safe and that it was all going wonderfully. So, and that was just yesterday. So this is really a finger in the eye for Sisi.
It demonstrates absolutely clearly that the state is incapable of protecting its minorities, whether it's Christians or whether it's the Sufis. I mean, both extremely big minorities as well that are important in Egyptian politics. I mean, I'm not sure whether I completely agree with Christopher that this will have a big effect on Sisi's position. I think
I don't think he'll change. I didn't mean he would change.
But the credibility gap that Claire is describing, will it hurt him? His followers will still follow him?
Well, no, it's a cumulative thing. I mean, when you talk about a credibility gap, we could have had this conversation about, say, Robert Mugabe a few weeks ago. Would unrest, would discontent affect him? Well, you wouldn't have thought so, and then all of a sudden it did. It's the kind. where it is likely to affect him the most is if the military begins to be restive underneath him, because it's essentially a military regime. And if there are people in the military who say, you know what, Mr. President General Abdel Fattah al-Sisi, this isn't working worth a damn. Your policies are not working for us. And the question is, what, again, it comes back to the counter-narrative. What is the point of what he's trying to do? It's to stabilize Egypt, but it's not stable. So you take a large part of the population that identified with the Muslim Brotherhood, and I'm not defending the Brotherhood, but a large part identified with it, and they have been all turned into outlaws. The question, when you take people and you turn them into outlaws, you shouldn't be surprised if they act like criminals.
Yeah. If they come back and bite you, I mean, that's what's happening. Yeah,
treat them like outlaws, which brings us now to the international reactions, and we see on that score the U.S. president tweeting that it's a horrible and cowardly terror attack on innocent and defenseless worshippers. The spokesperson for the White House saying we must collectively discredit the extremist ideology that forms the basis of their existence.
That's the counter-narrative again. So what is the counter-narrative? Does al-Sisi offer a counter-narrative? No. Does Donald Trump offer a counter-narrative to extremism? What? Everybody should come to Mar-a-Lago? I mean, what's the idea behind American counter-extremism? Is it freedom? Is it the rule of law? Very hard to argue for the rule of law in the United States.
But it's interesting, talking about counter-narrative, that the Sufis in Egypt over the last few years have consistently tried to offer a counter-narrative about what Islam should be in Egypt. And traditionally,
well, much kinder, gentler Islam. Yes, absolutely. And of course, that makes them enemies number one.
Yeah, precisely.
I think we often lose sight of the fact that Al-Qaeda, but particularly ISIS, their biggest enemies are fellow Muslims who don't agree with them. So the Shia, number one enemies for ISIS. And then after the Shia, the Sufis. Look at all the Sufi shrines that have been destroyed by the radical Sunni elements.
This is why when we talk about Trump, for instance, and we see that the travel ban and things like that, that put all the Muslims in the same ISIS label, are not the solution. It's part of the problem. I mean, you're making things worse because the first victims, and we see it today, I mean, again, are the Muslims. In numbers, I mean, and in frequency of attacks. Yeah.
Of course, there's two ways of interpreting it. One analyst we spoke to earlier said that they need to intimidate because they're losing support. So there's two ways of looking at it. And there is the international context. After the fall of Raqqa, the ISIS brand has taken a hit.
Yes, that's right. I mean, and Libya and I suppose Egypt are the battlegrounds, have been expected to become, ever bigger battlegrounds following the fall of Raqqa and the end of ISIS in Iraq. So, and I think this is going to be of huge concern now for the international community. They'll be looking at Egypt, a country of 90 million people, and worrying that that if it becomes a big centre of jihadist activity, that you could have an arc of jihadism stretching from Libya through Egypt to the border with Gaza and Gaza on the other side. And so that could...
Amr Abed Rabbo, on that point, one of our correspondents mentioning how after the fall of Gaddafi, a lot of weapons went from Libya to the northern Sinai region.
It went all over Africa, obviously. I'm not sure about the arc of jihadists, because I think, as Christopher said, Sisi won't change. It will be harsher and harsher, and nobody can afford to have these 90 million population country fall into chaos or into which part. But every day we're doing something, so it goes there.
It's very interesting. I was living in Egypt in the early 90s when there was, in fact, a major terrorist push there, and we were having a lot of these same discussions. Actually, one of the leaders of that was Ayman al-Zawahiri, who is now the head of Al-Qaeda. And he was forced out of Egypt. They were forced out of Egypt not just by brutal repression, of which there was a fair amount, but also because they miscalculated the Egyptian people again and again. They would carry out bombings that would alienate the population in a huge way. I'm not sure whether that's happening or not in Egypt right now. But the more you have a tough guy president who is also alienating people with his violence and with his repression, the easier it is for jihadists to make their
and a final word on that regarding the United States, because right now the leadership, the people around Donald Trump, a lot of them come from the military. You know, the old saying, to a carpenter, every problem looks like a nail. In the case of Egypt, which is the recipient of huge amounts of aid from the United States, that military prism, does that have an impact?
Well, yeah, but on the other hand, the military is very big on matrices, on looking at the results of military action. And if you look at the results of military action in the Sinai, as we were saying earlier, you can't think you're dealing with a very strong player if you're dealing with Sisi.
So yeah, I mean, I saw a survey that was done in Sinai last year, in March. 31 incidents involving the Sinai province group. 31 in the course of 2 weeks. You know, it doesn't say very much about the success of the military operation.
When we come back in the world this week, we're going to look at a big change for Zimbabwe. For the first time ever, they've changed presidents. Stay with us. You're watching The World This Week.
Talking Europe, presented by Catherine Nicholson.
With all the main European news, debates between representatives of the best and worst performing EU member states, and exclusive interviews with major personalities.
Talking Europe on France 24 and France24.com. Reporters, presented by Mark Owen.
Until recently, life had carried on as normal. But when Donald Trump came to power, everything changed. Violence and acts of intimidation against Muslim Americans have increased sharply. How are they coping with the rise of Islamophobia?
Reporters on France 24 and France24.com.
Hello and welcome back to the France 24 newsroom. I'm Thomas Waterhouse and this is a brief summary of the latest world news this hour. A gun and bomb attack on a Sufi mosque in Egypt leaves at least 235 people dead and dozens more injured. In retaliation, the military says its jets have now destroyed the vehicles used in that massive attack. The crocodile vows to serve all Zimbabweans and start rebuilding the nation. Emerson Mnangagwa is sworn into office at a huge ceremony in Harare, officially bringing an end to Robert Mugabe's 37-year presidency. Oscar Pistorius will be spending more time in prison than he initially thought. The Supreme Court of Appeal in South Africa increases his sentence to 13 years and 5 months for murdering his girlfriend, Riva Steinkamp. And over 6 years after war broke out in Syria, monitors say that over 340,000 people have now died, a third of them civilians. This as warring sides in that conflict gear up for a fresh round of UN peace talks in Geneva next week. That's all from me. Let's cross straight back to François Picard and the rest of the world this week. Do stay with us here on France 24.
Welcome back, or welcome if you're just joining us. It's The World This Week in partnership with The Daily Beast. And Christopher Dickey, foreign editor, is with us. Hello again. As is Robert Parsons, France 24 Chief International Affairs Editor. Claire Byrne of the French news agency AFP. And Franco-Syrian photojournalist Amr Abed Rabo. Amr, we were preparing the show. We found a picture of you this week. And we were wondering, Perhaps if we can call up that photo. Who the guy is, we'll see it now in a minute. It's coming. There it is. Who's that guy sitting next to you?
Who's that guy in the coat and tie? That's what I want.
What is that? Explain to us what is going on here.
If it's the fashion moment, yes, I should be wearing a suit maybe when I come to the world this week. No, I had the honor and I mean, was curious to meet President Macron. He liked a picture I've done of him earlier, so he invited me at the Élysée Palace, and we were looking at photos and
just looking at photos
and having coffee.
Okay.
What do you expect?
No, because you were discussing in your Facebook post about the need for cultural exchange.
Exactly.
And a couple of weeks back, when there was the opening of the Louvre Abu Dhabi, there was a lot of debate about whether or not this really does promote culture and all this sort of thing. This idea of the counter narrative that we were talking about in part one, discussing the Egypt attack, is that something you brought up with the president?
I spoke about that cultural resistance. That's very important. I think that we are mistaken if we really put all the eggs in the basket of the military response to all the Daesh phenomena and the extremism.
Does he get it?
He knew, of course, about it, but he was interested to talk about it with an artist and a photographer from the area and who travels a lot. I think, I mean, when we talk about the Louvre Abu Dhabi, it's a great concept, it's a great idea, it's a great place. I wish there would be more of these and maybe less Rafale deals, because it's if we had this policy, let's say, of museums for the last 50 or 60 years, instead of Mirage and Rafale and F-16 and whatever, we wouldn't have the same word today. So it is important. Culture and art are important, and we discussed this.
All right. We're going to turn our attention to what's been a historic couple of weeks in Zimbabwe. Exit Comrade Bob, enter the crocodile. Robert Mugabe's longtime security chief, Emerson Mnangagwa, sworn in 48 hours after the resignation of the country's only leader since their resistance movement overthrew white minority rule in 1980. Now, because of the recent falling out between Mnangagwa and Mugabe, which briefly forced the new president to flee, he's been able, you could say, to redefine himself. In his inauguration speech, he promised elections next year and compensation for white farmers who saw their land confiscated by the regime.
The dispossession of our ancestral lands was the fundamental reason for waging the liberation struggle. It would be a betrayal of the brave men and women who sacrificed their lives if we were to reverse the gains we have made in reclaiming our land. Therefore, I exhort beneficiaries of the land reform program to show their deservedness by demonstrating commitment to the utilization of the land now available to them for national food security and for the recovery of our economy.
All right, he doesn't say, Claire Byrne, what he'll do if ever those people who currently own the land don't make it more productive. But what do you make of those words?
Well, I think he's talking about all those farms that were taken oftentimes without compensation, forcibly from white farmers by war veterans, veterans of the independence struggle, and ruling party militia, many of which lay fallow ever since, and which really drove Zimbabwe, which used to be the breadbasket of southern Africa, major grain producer, into the ground. So I'm not sure how he's going to get them to till the land, but he also in that speech talked about compensation for white farmers as well, for those who didn't receive. So very much overtures to white Zimbabweans and also the international community, because he said that foreign investment in Zimbabwe would be protected what that may mean is that this indigenization legislation that they push through, they might need to review that.
Well, clearly he's hinting it's over. He said there are key choices to attract that foreign direct investment. Earlier we spoke to the Southern Africa director of Human Rights Watch, who is Zimbabwean, and who, well, gave him the benefit of the doubt in so much as even when he said that Robert Mugabe remains a father, a comrade in arms, and a mentor, he said it's good to be having those kinds of words on a day like today, because what Zimbabwe needs is a bit of serenity.
That's right. And I think those words are very typical of Zimbabweans, who have an extraordinary capacity for forgiveness, like many Africans, actually, in my experience, and an extraordinary lack of desire for retribution. And we saw Morgan Tsvangirai during the week, the opposition leader, who was left with a fractured skull in 2008 before the elections that he went on to win in the first round, saying, let the old man rest in peace, I bear him no ill will. And that's very much a sentiment you'll find in Zimbabwe. And so I think that Emmerson Mnangagwa knows that, and knows that he can count on a certain amount of goodwill from Zimbabweans, despite the blood he is accused of having on his own hands, and that as long as he can deliver some progress on the economic front, that on the democratic and human rights fronts, that he can buy some time on those scores.
Yeah, and there's lots of blood because there was that ethnic crackdown after independence. What did you make of his speech and what do you make of the crocodile, Robert Parsons, as he's called?
Well, it's difficult for me. It's difficult to take him at face value. I mean, I absolutely agree with what you're saying. There does seem to be a moment when something positive can come out of this, particularly on the economic side, if the reforms start to get moving, and if there is foreign investment. And the Chinese seem particularly keen at the moment. I imagine the Chinese have been saying an awful lot behind the scenes over the last few months and days probably as well.
There's speculation the British have as well behind the scenes.
Well, I imagine so, yeah. I think the key for me is going to be the elections, though, which are due next year, and how not just him, but how the party, how ZANU-PF approaches the elections. Because if they're going to be free and fair and the opposition gets its act together for once, ZANU-PF could get a real hiding. Given the way the popular mood seems to be moving at the moment, it's quite possible. Now, is the party prepared to let that happen? Honestly, I don't think it is.
And there's a variable in all this, which is the military. Now, the military's gotten heavily involved in election processes in the past. The military, which suddenly is flavor of the week after deposing Mr. Mugabe, will they stand idle?
Well, the question is, will they stand idle if their prerogatives are threatened? I mean, we're talking about a number of potential conflicts here, as I understand it. I mean, first of all, I mean, the original conflict of 2 weeks ago that we saw was basically Mugabe's comrades in arms against his companion in bed, right? It was the question of, was he going to have his wife succeed him, who would presumably take a lot of perks and a lot of authority away from the military. Now, she represented, or claimed to represent, this group called the G40, basically people under 40 years old, which I believe is a substantial majority of the population of Zimbabwe. Who will speak for them now? Is the old opposition going to speak for them? Let's put aside Grace Mugabe. I don't think she was speaking for them. But if somebody can mobilize them, that will be a threat to the military's prerogatives, to these war veterans, because we're not talking about the soldiers on the ground. We're talking about the officer corps who came out of the revolution. That's who Mnangagwa is representing, and that is who overthrew Mugabe, not because they wanted democracy, but because they didn't want their own power to be threatened.
Will ZANU-PF hold together without Mugabe at the helm as well?
Well, big question. Who knows? Who knows? But I think we can guarantee that the senior military is going to want to hang on to its prerogatives. And any threat to that will be something that one way or the other they will defeat. On
Wednesday, he returns from South Africa, Mnangagwa. And of course, his first words are in front of the party that's been in power since independence.
In front of ZANU-PF?
Yeah.
Yes, that's right. And actually, I must say, in terms of where ZANU-PF stands and, you know, the risk of divisions, I don't really think we're going to see a major fallout between this G40 sort of young, grabby wannabes that Grace Mugabe led and the old guard. I think that's been fought and won by the old guard with the military's backing. And going into the election, I think ZANU will actually be in quite a strong position. And that it will be difficult for the opposition to really push the change agenda while you have Mnangagwa saying, we must all come together as one nation. Let's not be divisive. You know, we need to all work together.
Yeah, let's talk about that opposition. You mentioned Morgan Tsvangirai, whose win was stolen, you say, a decade ago. He's the odd man out, it seems, in this process. He spoke to France 24.
The dispossession of our ancestral lands was the fundamental reason for waging the liberation struggle. It would be a betrayal of the brave men and women who
All right, so that was the president. We heard him earlier. Let's see if we can listen to Morgan Tsvangirai, who spoke to France 24.
Well, I don't even know whether a government of national unity is on the cards. If by now people have not discussed what form of government will emerge, then it's a ZANU-PF extension of Mugabe's rule. I was not contacted on anything. In fact, I was hoping that that process will kickstart.
Wasn't contacted on anything. There's a lot of disappointment in some circles in the opposition over the fact that Mugabe resigned, because they're saying if he had been impeached, then the opposition would have had a say and perhaps more bargaining power.
Yes, I can see that. And I do agree with you that Morgan Tsvangirai has been looking a bit lonely. I mean, every interview we've seen with him in the last couple of days, he's been sitting in in an office somewhere doing, talking over Skype, and he hasn't really been at the center of events. I've seen no interviews with him, in the middle of a mass of people shouting his name, though he did get a good reception today when he attended the inauguration. But I do think that they're looking a bit weak, and they're not fighting words from Tsvangirai.
Robert Rabo, the departure of Robert Mugabe after 37 years, and he was a stalwart in terms of he was one of Africa's best-known figures. The world's he'd gone on to become the second oldest head of state in the world. It was the oldest head of state in the world. It really is the end of an era for that generation.
It is, and it's terrible to think about all these very, very young countries. It reminds me also of Algeria, who have such an old president, and I remember Gaddafi used to say, when people used to tell him, we've been here for 40 years or something, he used to say, oh, the Queen of England have been here for even longer. So these people are totally disconnected. They have no idea what's going on. In this week, I liked very much the sequence where he was saying, the people love me, the people support me, and next day you see the people celebrating and enjoying and chanting his departure, his resigning.
Yeah, because Robert Parsons, last Sunday evening, what Amar is referring to, there's this speech on national television. Robert Mugabe gets up. The military is sitting behind him.
It was extraordinary.
And he doesn't resign.
He was totally detached from reality. There were people saying that he actually replaced the original speech to me given with another speech. Whether or not it's true, but he certainly gave the impression of being a man who was just in a completely different realm.
But Mubarak did the same thing.
Yeah.
Do you remember that?
Exactly.
During the Tahrir uprising, Mubarak came on, everybody thought, well, he's going to resign, and he didn't do it. And then they had to sort of okay, you're going to resign.
But in the meantime, you see people being auctioned in Libya because they're ready to anything to leave these countries. And it's, this reality takes us to the other reality. You can't forget this.
Although I was writing a story about a young American woman who was arrested for tweeting criticism of Mugabe before all of this happened. And I was struck by the website she worked for, which is a Zimbabwe website. It basically is sort of the Jon Stewart of Zimbabwe, and it's very, very, very interesting. Martha O'Donovan, her name is.
Because that's the interesting thing. We've chronicled over the past 2 weeks. We reminded everyone of the currency that disappeared, the economy that collapsed, and yet Zimbabwe is this country that exports teachers to other countries in the region. Explain that to us, because a lot of people have been asking that question in the newsroom. But this is the country where you have these sort of parallel universes, it seems.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, it's still got this extraordinarily well-educated workforce and no jobs for them. So it's great. It's been great at churning out teachers, nurses.
A bit like Cuba in that respect.
Yeah, exactly. And that base, that very strong educational base, which is really down to Robert Mugabe himself, who had 6 degrees and the 7th in violence, as he used to boast. And his first wife, if I'm not mistaken, was a teacher. He was absolutely passionate about education. So yes, you got lots and lots of young professionals. Many of them went wriggled under the wire into South Africa or across the Limpopo River. Sometimes during the rainy season when it was filled with crocodiles, I saw them come across that border, pouring into South Africa in search of jobs as nannies, as cooks, and there are around 3 million by some accounts in South Africa. And many of them will have always dreamed of going home. And there's never really been a great love among Zimbabweans in South Africa for South Africa, which they find very dangerous.
And the feeling's been reciprocal as well, it has to be said. South Africans are not very fond of them.
Not very fond of them, and they've been, the target of these bouts of xenophobic violence we've seen in the last decade. So they'll be very anxious to go home, and could be a great asset, a huge asset to Zimbabwe as it tries to recover.
Just final word on that, because we've been talking about how Zimbabweans have been saying, South Africa, stay out of this one, because in the past the feeling that Jacob Zuma, the president, sided too much with Mugabe. Is this a problem for Zuma, an extra problem or not? Jacob
Zuma, and particularly Thabo Mbeki before him, he was the advocate of quiet diplomacy with Zimbabwe, which was basically, which he contrasted with the West's megaphone diplomacy on Zimbabwe. And he said, no, you have to go quietly about it, which basically was, to kind of turn a blind eye, convene another SADC summit where Mugabe would nod off and they would all leave after 7 hours. And Jacob Zuma did continue that. But yes, and he was noticeably absent today in Harare at Mnangagwa's inauguration. But yeah, it's not good news for Jacob Zuma, that's for sure, because what has happened is that a leader who allowed his party to pilfer state resources, got his hiding, got his comeuppance, and a
cautionary tale.
A cautionary tale. Zuma must fall was a hashtag a year ago. So, and he must be nervous.
Claire Byrne, I want to thank you. I want to thank as well Christopher Dickey, Amar Abed Rabo, Robert Parsons. Stay with us. Media Watch is next.